I believe that Fuad Abyad is right. Although Good morning, friends. In this video, you will learn why bulking is more effective than main gaining for gifted bodybuilders. But before you do, please subscribe to the channel if you're not already, like the video, and comment on the video to help with the channel's growth. Now let's get started. First of all, good morning, friends. I was thinking to move on to new topics, of course, as I reported to you yesterday, moving past protein. We've recently been discussing how dietary protein affects major growth pathways in the body. We did three videos on that, and I thought to move on now onto other topics. We have so many varied topics we discuss on the channel, of course. Yesterday, after I made my final video, the Q&A on protein, by the way, every morning, what I try to do nowadays is go into my Instagram and randomly select 5 or so DMs to respond to earlier in the morning or right after I record while I'm editing. So yesterday, right after recording the Q&A, I came across a question from a subscriber about my opinion on Greg Doucette's concept of main gaining. The subscriber was suggesting that maybe the main gaining isn't an ideal way to gain muscle as a bodybuilder, and I responded with my thoughts, and then I thought maybe they were helpful, so I put them on a story on Instagram. Well, yesterday I was thinking this topic should really have been discussed in the Q&A, honestly. So I thought to make a separate video briefly discussing this concept of main gaining versus bulking. I think it'll be helpful because it plays on the exact concepts we've been discussing recently. These major growth pathways, mTOR, and how nutrients affect their signaling. So let's get started about this topic. Oh, really quickly, before we get started, I should mention that this debate has been going on YouTube between, I think, several people, but most notably of which are Greg Doucette and Fuad Abyad. Fuad Abyad is a heavyweight bodybuilder, whereas Greg Doucette is, I guess it was originally a 212 bodybuilder and a classic physique bodybuilder. Greg Doucette, I think, championed this idea that bodybuilders, who oftentimes, what bodybuilders tend to do is they have cyclical changes in their diet and training. They try to gain muscle usually in the off season and then lose fat in the on season before they compete. So they go through these cycles. Some of these bodybuilders eat a major calorie excess in the off season. They call this bulking. The goal is to gain muscle because originally it was thought that muscle is easier to gain when you're in a calorie surplus. So being in a calorie surplus all the time ensures you can gain as much muscle as you would desire to. Now apparently Greg Doucette introduced another option which is called main gaining. I don't know how this term, by the way, the etymology of the term, I have no idea. Somebody should explain below what's main gaining. But maintaining and gaining, maybe something like that. But so main gaining from Greg Doucette is essentially having a lower calorie surplus in your off season so that you bulk but don't gain as much fat. I think this is what I understood from him. Don't gain as much fat so that on the on season you can lose the fat quicker and lose less muscle trying to lose the fat. But I think there are other values that Greg Doucette attributes to this main gaining approach. The most important thing we want to talk about here today is the integral disagreement between Fuad and Greg, which is that Greg believes that you get the best results. If you want to become a heavyweight bodybuilder one day, you'll get the best results in the long term by main gaining. Not by having 1,000 calories past your maintenance limit in the off season, but by having maybe 500 or 300, something less. On the other hand, Fuad Abyad maintains that there's something special about bulking, that it produces a kind of growth that isn't replicable with a small caloric surplus. Fuad, in his argument, uses this, what I mentioned earlier, if you're on a hefty calorie surplus, he, in order to defend his thinking, which is empirically observed, by the way, in his own life and in other bodybuilders' lives. That's why he's saying this. But in order to defend himself against the very rhetorical Greg Doucette, he thought that maybe, which is a reasonable thought, that maybe because you're in a high calorie surplus, at no point during the day are you nutrient deprived and unable to grow. This again goes back to the building block model of nutrients. These things are all used to synthesize something in the body, so if you have these things in a flux in the bloodstream all the time, you can access them. So that was why Fuad thought that bulking may be superior, and on the other hand, Doucette thought that this was all unnecessary. And in practice, also Doucette refers to his empirical observation that in practice, heavy bulking is not more efficient. Now, what do I think about this? Let's first begin with diet and growth factors. Now, to be clear, we're going to talk about how diet and caloric surpluses affect growth factor signaling in the body. There are potentially many other reasons bulking may be more efficient for bodybuilders than, for certain bodybuilders, than main gaining. But for this video to be short and to the point and make sense, we'll isolate it to growth factors. And within the subject of growth factors, I'm going to isolate my discussion mostly to IGF-1. As an example, many other growth factors exist, like epidermal growth factor, vascular endothelial growth factor, transforming growth factors. There's so many other growth factors that modulate IGF-1, that are downstream modulated by IGF-1, and most importantly, that have an interaction with mTOR, the major nutrient sensing growth pathway in the body. So let's begin with IGF-1 as an example. As we discussed in our protein series, the two components of diet, the two major components that affect IGF-1 levels in the bloodstream in humans are the protein consumption, the amount of protein, and as we learned later, it's mainly animal proteins that do this, but the amount of protein and the total calories, not the amount of carbohydrates in the diet. This is called nutritional geometry, the portion of the diet from these things. Not the amount of fats in the diet, but the total calories and the protein. That's what raises IGF-1. We also know, that I haven't discussed this before, but among anorexics, a biomarker of anorexia and bulimia is low IGF-1 signaling. So in people, generally, a normal variance of their diet, IGF-1 is associated with total calories consumed. In people who consume very low calories, low IGF-1 is a biomarker of their disease state, consuming low calories. Also, for example, in obese children, IGF-1 levels are elevated. I'll cite maybe 3 studies here. There are some studies that show an opposite effect, but we'll see why that is shortly. In children that are obese, IGF-1 levels are elevated, even though pulsatile growth hormone is inhibited. For those that don't know, obesity really inhibits the growth hormone network very potently. But their IGF-1 levels are increased such that the IGF-1 doesn't just compensate for their reduced GH in terms of their height trajectory, but in fact, in early age, before the age of 12 or so, their height is associated with their obesity. So thin people have very low IGF-1 levels. Fat kids have higher IGF-1 levels. In adults, IGF-1 levels have a U-shaped effect or a U-shaped relationship with obesity, such that initially, as people get more obese, their IGF-1 levels rise, and then it goes down. And it seems to be because of specifically visceral fat. Visceral fat seems to cause some dysregulation in the IGF-1 system. But also you can keep in mind that the issue we're trying to look at here really isn't obesity. We're trying to look at people that consume a lot of calories. I'm trying to point out to you guys that even though obesity really harms the GH network and harms the IGF-1 network, in some contexts, obese people still have higher IGF-1 levels. And very thin people have lower IGF-1 levels. So what did we learn here? We learned that total calories determine IGF-1 levels within people that are consuming normal diets. We learned that people consuming very low calories have low IGF-1 levels. We learned that although fat itself harms IGF-1 signaling, even getting fatter just because of consuming more calories most likely raises IGF-1 levels even at the extremes of people who are obese or getting obese. So what we can tell here is that the amount of calories modulates this growth factor signaling, and we learned that there isn't that much diminishing marginal returns within the frame of normal caloric consumption in people. Why I say that is because the obese still have higher IGF-1 levels, which means there may be a higher ceiling on how much raising your calories may increase your growth factors. Maybe it's not simply having beyond maintenance or below maintenance. In fact, let me assure you, it is certainly not that. The question is how far the calories can keep raising your growth factors. That isn't known in research. But I can tell you from how much I study, mainly in my case, brain growth factors, but also other growth factors for longevity purposes, I can tell you for sure that the calories, there is some spectrum of increases in growth factors as calories go beyond maintenance. And this is the issue that Greg seems to be missing. But let's take this a step further. Beyond IGF-1 as an example growth factor, let's talk about how people's genetics might affect the way bulking affects them. Now imagine you're somebody that isn't naturally very skinny, but isn't somebody that can put on muscle very easily. Like say generically you're of East Asian descent. Not everybody who's East Asian puts on muscle difficultly, but more on average. If you're of East Asian descent and you decide not to main gain, you decide to bulk properly, to go 1,000 calories above your maintenance limit. During your bulking phase, that's 6 months or whatever, you're going to gain less muscle per fat compared to somebody with better genetics for developing muscle, which by the way may be genetics that make them live less long lives actually. But for example, you'll gain less muscle per fat than the average African American or the average, for example, Polynesian that have myostatin polymorphisms or polymorphisms that lower their myostatin. African Americans have many polymorphisms that affect their ability to build muscle, but also polymorphisms in the IGF-1 system and so on. So the point is, depending on your genetics, basically, depending on whether you were built to be a bodybuilder, which the things that affect that are how hard it is for you to gain fat, or how easy it is for you to lose fat, and how easy it is for you to gain muscle, other than the shape of your muscle and so on. So if you're built to be a bodybuilder, when you go on these heavy bulking periods, you'll raise your growth factors more than the guy who was main gaining. But you'll gain more muscle because of it, because you don't have genetics that were made for somebody not to be a bodybuilder. But if you have genetics where you don't respond to IGF-1 very well, like you have a polymorphism in the IGF-1 receptor like I do, well, this rise in IGF-1 won't mean that much for your muscular development compared to somebody else. So you could imagine, for example, that Greg Doucette may actually believe what he's saying. I'm not saying that Greg is lying here, or, I mean, he is wrong, but I don't know, I'm not saying he's lying. Greg, for example, judging by the difference in Greg's physique when he went on steroids compared to before being on steroids, it seems to be that Greg doesn't respond much to mTOR signaling, even though he started using steroids later in life, which of course has less of an effect on your growth in the long term, especially with GH and so on. But he may be someone that doesn't respond that much to mTOR, IGF-1, all these growth signaling pathways that bodybuilders need. He may be someone who's a hard gainer. For him, going on a bulking phase may have led him to gain more fat and not much more muscle, because he can't gain much muscle in the first place. Maybe, for example. So he may have had a different experience than Fouad. Fouad may be someone who's built for bodybuilding. When he went on that off season, he mutated. You know, something really changed, and he can pinpoint it. He tells you, I know something that was different when I went on a proper bulk. That comes from experience. I should note though that the majority of people that are bodybuilding, I think, would benefit more from bulking than from main gaining. And not only that, but main gaining may prevent them from ever achieving their goals. Even if they use steroids, growth hormone, Increlex, and all of that, that's how important food is for these nutrient sensing pathways. And by the way, it's not so simple, just to break this down, it's not so simple as mTOR is on or off. It's not like, oh, I'm taking GH, steroids, mTOR is on, I don't need to rely on protein for that. And it's also not as simple as just mTOR. mTOR has so many downstream growth factors which are sometimes independently modulated by these lifestyle choices like total calories consumed. And also, mTOR can be turned on to varying degrees. So these things are very important. In the end, what you need to know is, I believe most people who are bodybuilders will benefit more from bulking versus main gaining for achieving their goals in the long term. And not only that, but it may be very dangerous to main gain for the rest of your career. You may never achieve your goals, genuinely, if you follow what Greg Doucette is saying. Most importantly, you should know that increasing calories continues to increase growth factors in some kind of gradient or spectrum, such that it's not a finite, I'm above maintenance, therefore growth factors are on. It's not as simple as that for sure. Now, specifically about bodybuilders, the upper limit to how raising calories in a surplus may affect your growth may be modulated by other factors that's involved in their life, other than calories, total protein consumption. It includes steroids, growth hormone, Increlex, insulin use, all of these kind of things. So there's, other than genetics. So some bodybuilders may be able to raise their calories even beyond what a natural would and continue to benefit. But also, in the natural's case, there aren't as many variables to manipulate. So the calories are very important. Now, for bodybuilders that have less than ideal genetics, that means those who gain less fat per amount of muscle, they would still not reduce their calories when bulking. The reason is because of these growth factors. Now, bodybuilding coaches don't really realize that. They don't enunciate it, but they learned it through trial and error. Having more calories and burning more calories will increase your growth factors and cause you to grow more in the off season than you would otherwise. I've asked the top bodybuilding coaches why they do this, and they say it's because of better ability to digest foods. But this is what I believe is happening. So, for example, if you go to Chad Nichols and you were gaining fat easily on the off season, like King Kamali, for example, what Chad would do isn't have you reduce your protein or calorie consumption. He would first have you increase your cardio. you would get up to the point where you're doing 2 hours of cardio a day, but still eating 10 ounces of meat per meal and overeating, really a lot of protein and a lot of calories. That's what built Olympians. That's what built Ronnie Coleman. And that's what built, well, maybe not Big Ramy. I don't know about his history, but right now Chad is also coaching Big Ramy. This is what the top coaches do to the top athletes to create this thing that in bodybuilding they colloquially call mutation. What, for example, Nick Walker has evidence, what Fouad Abiad also had, he developed mutation. This kind of development of new muscle, it's hyperplasia over time, which causes more definition in the muscle, a different 3D look to the muscle, which also involves water retention and so on, but it changes the muscle. The muscle will not do this if you're main gaining, even if you're using steroids. I strongly believe this. So to conclude, I believe that Fouad Abiad is right. Although Greg Doucette may be right for a small portion of people who are trying to bodybuild. Those are the people probably, honestly, with the centenarian genes. The genes that always focus their cells on cellular repair. Their cells don't want to grow anyway despite them. These people might just get fat on their bulking seasons and not really take a major step toward their goals. But if people follow the guidelines honestly outlined by Fouad and others for their bulking off seasons, they will be able to get closer to their goals in a way that isn't replaceable by a small calorie surplus. And the reason why is because growth factors increase differentially across calorie surpluses. To what degree, we don't know. Exactly how, we don't know. And what is the calorie surplus limit that causes this or stops to cause it? We don't know exactly. We do know that getting obese harms these growth signals, at least in the case of IGF-1 and growth hormone, but having more calories helps them. I think the crux of Doucette's misunderstanding that main gaining is actually ideal for the majority of people comes from his impression of nutrition as building blocks. Nutrients are both building blocks and signaling molecules, as I keep mentioning. And when you think of nutrients as signaling molecules, you come to realize why, and you look at the evidence, you come to realize why having higher calories can continue to increase growth factor signaling and potentially differentially in ways we can't predict exactly. On the other hand, on Fouad's side, I think his reasoning about the danger of being hypocaloric in individual moments is reasonable also, but it's also relying on that building block model of nutrition. Like, we're out of some nutrient right now, so we can't synthesize something. But instead, it may be the effects on growth factor signaling, not just throughout the day, not just never having mTOR down, but also having it fully activated or having its downstream growth factors fully activated. Do you see what I mean? Anyway, friends, I look forward to seeing you again this afternoon when we're going to find out why I am four-eyed. See you soon.